Hello, everybody who is listening, and thank you for joining me. We're going to talk about climate change and how fucking real it is. Global warming and climate change. Is there a difference? What do you think? Supposedly there is, and supposedly there isn't. That's my opinion. Anyways, climate change and global warming. Data, impact, and solutions for the future. That is our discussion of the day. And I decided to just go ahead and crank this out because I know there's a ton of information out there. And we are constantly experiencing natural disasters almost weekly, I want to say, around the world these days. I'll just say I was born in 1973. I'm kind of proud of that. And I should just let everybody know that more. And I still feel like a young soul because I have my kids that are in their 20s and one teenager. And so they kind of keep me young and up to date with the younger culture. But when I was a teenager, I believe it was my junior or senior year in high school, I was writing about this shit back then. And now many things have changed, but it hasn't really gotten better, obviously. Climate change was not talked about. It wasn't, a thing back then, and it wasn't being talked about or recognized globally, and solutions weren't really being talked about. At least we've gotten to that point. And there's so much more that can be done. And I, for one, am sitting here talking about this into a microphone with headphones on at, what time is it? 6:22 in the evening on a Friday night because I feel that it is very important to spread the news, spread the awareness. That's the first step, is for people to be aware, because there, believe it or not, is not enough awareness in this world, if you can imagine. So if you're listening to this, if you can spread the word to anybody and everybody that may need to know this information, please do. All right, let's get started. So I have narrowed this information down just to the past 2 decades, the past 20 years, and what is the most current. So in the past 2 decades, climate change has shifted from a topic of academic debate to one of the most urgent global issues. Rising temperatures, shifting weather patterns, and more frequent extreme weather events are all signs that global warming is accelerating. This blog will take a closer look at the data from the past 20 years, offering actionable solutions that anyone can participate in to combat this global crisis. So, in the state of global warming, a 20-year overview. Here we go. First, we've got rising global temperatures. Okay, and some say that's not very significant. It doesn't sound like a lot. It doesn't matter, y'all, if it sounds like a lot or not. Okay, what I'm about to tell you may not sound significant, but it is, because that is what's happening, okay? And obviously, temperatures rising cause glaciers and ice to melt in the Arctic. The melting is causing the ocean to rise. It's causing Mama Ocean not to be very happy, right? Which is then causing disturbance in the ocean, which is the most vast creature on the planet. She covers more area than any landmass. And when she's not happy, there's going to be hurricanes. There's going to be all kinds of things that are going to happen on land as well. Okay, rising temperatures cause more wildfires. I'm just kind of ranting and going off right now, but let's get back to the stats. Rising global temperatures, according to the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the NOAA, the past 2 decades have seen a steady rise in global temperatures, with 2023 being one of the hottest years on record. And I bet you, after the stats of 2024, which is the year we're in right now, probably have preceded that. Climate.gov, which monitors trends based on NOAA data, shows that since the early 2000s, Earth's average surface temperature has risen by about, Fahrenheit, we've got 0.14 degrees, or 0.08 Celsius per decade, okay? That's just per decade. So this might seem small, right? But it is significant when scaled across the entire planet. In particular, 2020 tied with 2016 as the warmest year since records began in the late 1800s. NASA's Goddard Institute for Space Studies points out that the average global temperature in 2020 was 1.02 Celsius, 1.84 Fahrenheit above the baseline average from 30 years 1951 to 1980, reinforcing the accelerating warming trend. Greenhouse gas emissions, let's talk about that. The Environmental Defense Fund reports that carbon dioxide, methane, and nitrous oxide are the primary drivers of global warming, with CO2 contributing the most to the greenhouse effect. Over the last 20 years, CO2 levels have risen dramatically, passing 420 parts per million for the first time in human history in 2021, compared to about 370 parts per million in 2000. The increase in emissions is largely tied to human activities like the burning of fossil fuels for energy, deforestation, conventional agriculture, and particularly animal feedlots, which has become a significant contributor to greenhouse gases. The Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change, the IPCC, estimates that human activities have caused around 1.1 degrees Celsius of warming since pre-industrial times, with temperatures expected to rise by another 1.5 Celsius between 2030 and 2050. If emissions continue to be unchecked, which basically that means the emissions aren't really being checked. Our government's not doing its job, right? Yeah. Sea levels are on the rise and melting ice is happening. One of the most dramatic consequences of global warming and sea level rise. Yes, this is one of the most dramatic consequences, right? Our sea levels are rising. Hurricanes are happening more than ever. People living on the coastlines are threatened, driven by the melting of glaciers and ice sheets, particularly in Greenland and Antarctica, as well as the thermal expansion of seawater as it warms. The United Nations Environment Program, the UNEP, warns that if current trends continue, sea levels could rise by 1 meter or 3.3 feet by 2100. Putting millions of people living in coastal areas at risk. Cities like Miami, New York, and Jakarta are already experiencing more frequent flooding due to higher tides and storm surges, a preview of what is to come. Another significant impact of global warming is the increase of these extreme weather events that we're seeing, if not weekly, definitely on a regular basis, around the world globally. According to the Environmental Defense Fund, the frequency and intensity of these events like hurricanes, wildfires, droughts, and heat waves have surged. For example, Hurricane Harvey in 2017 dropped over 60 inches of rain in some parts of Texas, while California's wildfire season has become longer and more destructive year by year, driven by the higher temperatures and prolonged droughts. Just in the past month, there have been 2 substantial hurricanes hitting North Carolina and Florida. Hundreds of people and animals lost their homes, and many were killed. I personally know a few of the families that were affected like they have never before seen in their lifetime. Research from the World Meteorological Organization shows that the number of extreme weather events has increased 5-fold over the last 50 years, with 2023 seeing record heat waves across Europe and North America. This growing unpredictability is placing immense strain on our ecosystems, agriculture, and human infrastructure. So let's talk about the role of animal agriculture, the cattle industry's impact on climate change. Animal agriculture, particularly the cattle industry, is a significant contributor to greenhouse gas emissions. Significant, y'all. Cows produce methane. I think most of us know that. A greenhouse gas that is 25 times more potent than CO2 in trapping heat in the atmosphere during their digestive process, a process known as enteric fermentation. The United Nations Food and Agriculture Organization estimates that 14.5% of global greenhouse gas emissions come from the livestock sector, with cattle responsible for the majority of this output. Let me tell you about how I have to hold my breath for at least a minute every time I drive through the Central Valley on the I-5 or on the 99, which are the 2 highways that drive through the valley parts of my home state, California. Methane emissions from cattle are not the only concern. The industry also contributes to deforestation. As large tracts of land are cleared for grazing or growing feed crops like GMO soy, this deforestation eliminates forests that act as carbon sinks, further contributing to the rise in atmospheric CO2 levels. Additionally, raising cattle requires significant amounts of water and land, leading to further environmental degradation. The expansion of pasture land to raise cattle was responsible for 41% of tropical deforestation. Most of this converted land came from Brazil. Its expansion of beef production in the last decade accounts for 1/4, 24%, of tropical deforestation of the Amazon rainforests. This also means that most deforestation in Brazil is driven by cattle ranching. Most meaning 72%, experts say. Cattle in other parts of Latin America, such as Argentina and Paraguay, also accounted for a large amount of deforestation, 11% of the total. Most deforestation for beef, therefore, occurs in Latin America, with another 4% happening in Africa. This is based on data from ourworldindata.org. I'll have a link in the show notes. Palm oil and soy are also claiming headlines for their environmental impact. They are categorized as oil seeds, which also include a range of smaller commodities such as sunflower, rapeseed, or canola oil, and sesame. These seed oils drove 18% of deforestation. In Indonesia, palm oil was the biggest component of this. In neighboring Malaysia, The expansion of oil seeds was also a major driver of forest loss. Soybeans are the most common oil seed in Latin America. While many people immediately think of food products such as tofu or soy milk when they hear the word soy, most of the global soybean production is used as feed for livestock or biofuels. A mere 6% is used for direct human food consumption. The impact of soy production is one we look at in more detail in a related article that will be in the actually, the related article will be in the blog that I am referring to, that I've written and put on my website, but I will have a link to the blog in the show notes. Combination of beef and oil seeds account for nearly 60% of all the deforestation. And another report in 2020 from the FAO, the cattle industry alone produced about 65% of livestock related methane emissions, making it a key target for reducing agriculture emissions. So, as you can see, these are huge numbers, and it is a huge, huge part of what's happening here. Yeah, so a lot of people know about this. A lot of people don't. I'm just trying to spread awareness on this because many people think of global warming, climate change having to do with emissions from cars, fossil fuels. Um, but what's happening, on our land with just the raising of cattle for meat consumption is just pure greed. It's really, as far as I'm concerned, animal cruelty. I have not yet to eat any meat in this type of, industry where they are just totally degrading the environment and contributing to climate change on such a high level. When I started eating meat, very rarely about a decade ago, I swore I would never contribute to this, and I have not. I just have no desire when I know what's happening out there. It's just really quite disgusting. There are several ways that we can reduce the impact of the cattle industry on climate change, many of which involve changing consumption habits and supporting sustainable agricultural practices. Okay, so shifting toward a plant-based diet doesn't mean you have to be completely plant-based. If you want to be, that's great. If you're healthy and you feel great and you just, totally steer away from eating meat, that's awesome. Even if you can do that for a time, it really helps. Reducing global meat consumption, particularly beef, is one of the most effective ways to reduce methane emissions. Studies show that shifting to a more plant-based diet can reduce an individual's carbon footprint significantly. The University of Oxford conducted a study in 2018 that found switching to a plant-based diet could reduce food-related emissions by up to 73% per person. Even reducing meat consumption by adopting a flexitarian approach, which is my standard right now, eating mostly plant-based and consuming meat occasionally, maybe 1 or 2 times a week, can make a substantial difference. Adopting sustainable farming practices and purchases, regenerative agriculture, and sustainable grazing practices can help mitigate the environmental damage caused by cattle farming techniques like this. Rotational grazing and reforesting land used for cattle farming can improve soil health and increase carbon sequestration. That word's a little difficult for me. That's where you're pulling carbon out of the atmosphere. And there's actually practices that will pull carbon down and reduce global warming. And so regenerative agriculture is helping that, building the soil, actually like compost, like spreading compost. There's been studies, actually I didn't talk about this in the blog, but there have been studies where people put like really healthy compost all over the soil, like an inch, and cover a certain part of land. And then they see what happens, and they somehow can like test this where they can tell that the carbon is being pulled down into the land out of the atmosphere just by spreading compost. It's amazing. It's really really great work that's being done out there, and I hope more people do it, more farmers. And you could even do it, you don't have to be a per se farmer, but even if you have a small garden space and you're growing organically and you're spreading compost every year, or twice a year, it's helping. The EDF, Environmental Defense Fund, again, they are advocating for supporting farmers to adopt these sustainable practices as healthier soils can absorb CO2, reducing net emissions. Improving animal diets and management. Innovations in animal feed are being explored to reduce methane emissions from cattle. Research shows that adding certain types of seaweed to cattle feed can reduce methane emissions by up to 80%. Additionally, improving manure management practices such as capturing methane from waste through anaerobic digesters can further reduce emissions from the cattle industry. Support policies that reduce agricultural emissions. It's another way we can support these policies. Governments play a critical role in encouraging sustainable agriculture practices. Supporting policies, when we vote, right? When we vote and we see anything that has to do with this, incentivizing farmers to adopt carbon-friendly techniques, reducing meat production subsidies, or promoting alternative plant-based proteins can have a broad impact on global emissions as well. Consumers can advocate for these policies by supporting leaders and organizations that prioritize climate-friendly agriculture reforms. So what's the human impact? Why immediate action is critical? While natural factors like volcanic activity and solar variability contribute to climate changes, the overwhelming scientific consensus is that human activity is the dominant force driving the current crisis. The IPCC has stressed that without rapid, widespread reductions in greenhouse gas emissions, we are likely to experience more severe consequences, including food shortages, mass migration, and widespread ecosystem collapse. But it's not all doom and gloom. Many scientists believe that if we act now, we start acting now to make changes, we can mitigate the worst impacts of climate change and even begin to reverse some of the damage. The solutions fall into two broad categories: mitigation and adaptation. So what is mitigation? Reducing emissions. Okay, so let's start by talking transitioning to clean energy is one of the top solutions here. One of the most effective ways to combat climate change is to transition away from the use of fossil fuels and adopt renewable energy sources like wind, solar, and hydropower. So we are doing this. We need to do it more. We've been talking about this for decades, and it just really need to push legislature to pass laws to do it more. And also, we can make choices by the cars we drive, if possible, which helps as well. According to the International Energy Agency, the IEA, renewable energy capacity has more than doubled over the past 20 years, but fossil fuels still account for about 80% of the world's energy consumption. That's way too high, y'all. To make a real impact, governments and businesses need to accelerate investment in renewable infrastructure, and individuals can do their part by switching to clean energy providers or installing solar panels on their homes. The EDF estimates that increasing the use of renewable energy could reduce CO2 emissions by as much as 50% in 2050, which is 25 years from now. It's not that far away. That's 50% reduction if we push our governments to change more and we switch to more renewable energy ourselves. Energy efficiency. The more we can be energy efficient is another critical solution in improving energy. Simply changing things like upgrading to LED lights, using energy efficient appliances, improving our home insulation can significantly reduce energy consumption and, by extension, greenhouse gas emissions. According to Energy Star, which we've probably all heard of, seeing appliances with the Energy Star little label on it, if every household in the US adopted energy efficient practices, we could reduce carbon emissions by the equivalent of taking 21 million cars off the road each year. Well, that sounds significant, doesn't it? So let's all try to do that. Sorry, I'm not laughing. It's just, yeah, it's crazy data out there. Here's that word again. Carbon sequestering. I like saying sequestering more. Sequestration. Pulling carbon out of the atmosphere is what that means. In addition to reducing emissions, we can also remove the existing CO2 from the atmosphere through natural and technological solutions. Forest restoration, sustainable soil management, organic and regenerative practices, and ocean-based carbon capture are all promising strategies for carbon sequestering. The UNEP supports initiatives like reforestation projects that can absorb billions of tons of CO2 over the coming decades. Okay, so they're supporting this, so maybe they can push legislature all over the world globally to do this, because that's a huge organization. And individuals can contribute by supporting or participating in tree planting efforts, yay, and sustainable land management practices. Every tree planted helps absorb CO2. A lot of us know this already. Trees are good. We need more trees, more healthy trees, and providing habitats for wildlife, benefiting both the climate and biodiversity. Yes, I had to add this when I was researching my information. I wasn't finding enough about this from organizations, but there's definitely a lot of data if you look, for it. And I knew that it was when I had studied about plastic pollution. I have a podcast on that. I think it's the first one that I launched. I knew that plastic was not helping the situation, so I looked into that and added that to the podcast here. Stop using plastic, please. Reduce and reuse, please. Single-use plastic is produced from fossil fuels. Okay, many people do not know this. Extracting and creating these plastics emits vast amounts of greenhouse gases. Okay, this should be talked about more. It is estimated that just the extraction of these fossil fuels and their transportation to plastic factories emits 1.5 to 12.5 million metric tons of greenhouse gases. Removing forested land for oil extraction and pipeline construction has also released more than 1.6 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide into the atmosphere. This land clearing also limits the amount of carbon dioxide removed from the atmosphere. The refinement of plastics emits an addition of 184 to 213 million metric tons of greenhouse gases each year. Landfills, where single-use plastics are sent, account for more than 15% of methane emissions. The disposal of more plastics in landfills leads to increases in landfill size and these emissions. There is an enormous floating mass of plastic in the Pacific Ocean right now, and I think there's another one actually in the Atlantic. Yeah, I don't think it's the Mediterranean, but I'm pretty sure it's like the Atlantic or Baltic or somewhere over there. There's another one forming. Twice the size of Texas. This is the one in the Pacific I'm talking about. It's twice the size of our largest state that continues to grow. Okay. That can't be making Mama Ocean happy or healthy or helping her to sequester the, carbon out of the air. Plastic pollution affects the most vulnerable communities first. Developed countries such as the United States send their plastic to developing countries for processing. Eventually, the amount of plastic can become so overwhelming that these communities run out of ways to dispose of it and become covered in plastic trash. This is based on data from the University of Colorado in Boulder, and there'll be a link in the show notes. There's a lot of information on that, though, on other sites as well. Adaptation. Okay, this is the other way that we can help. There's mitigation and there's adaptation. So we're finding solutions here, and adaptation is preparing for the unavoidable. Okay. So while mitigating climate change is essential, we also need to adapt to the changes that are already in motion. This includes building resilient infrastructures. Governments and communities must invest in infrastructure that can withstand extreme weather events. These extreme weather events, as I talked about earlier, are happening weekly, monthly, globally. We're not going to stop hearing about this probably, but we need to prepare. We can't really, completely stop it. We need to find balance within it. And this could mean doing things like reinforcing buildings that are in hurricane-prone areas, constructing seawalls to protect against rising tides, or implementing water management systems in drought-stricken regions. Supporting sustainable agriculture. This is a huge one. Farmers are already feeling the impact of climate change through unpredictable weather patterns and changing growing seasons. Adopting sustainable practices like precision farming, crop diversification, and regenerative agriculture can help make food systems more resilient. Consumers can support this shift by buying local, organic produce and reducing food waste. Meaning compost. Compost, y'all. Education and advocacy. Raising awareness about climate change and its solutions is critical. Schools, communities, and individuals need to become better educated about the science behind global warming and the actions we all need to take to mitigate it. So pass the word, spread the word. If you want to share this podcast, please do. So the conclusion here is that everyone has to play a role, okay? Everyone. I mean, think, I'm just one person. I'm not going to make a difference. Yes, we all make a difference. If we say that, if we're saying that, then someone else is saying that, and someone else is saying that, and then nobody's doing anything. Like, 5% of the population care. That's not going to work. We need to spread the word. We all care enough to not want to see these devastation, disasters happening to our friends and family. And we are all going to feel it at some point. If we haven't, we're going to be next. And we want to have a better world. We want to have a safe and beautiful world for our kids and our grandkids and future. So we're all here to do our part. The climate crisis is very immense, and it's all in our capacity to address it. Over the past 20 years, we've learned that while the damage is significant, there is still time to mitigate the worst effects of global warming. By transitioning to clean energy, improving energy efficiency, supporting carbon sequestration projects, and preparing our communities for a changing climate, we can build a more sustainable future. We can do small things ourselves at home by composting, yes, recycling, managing our waste, I do want to say here that trying to not use plastic is the best thing, because plastic is really, at the end of the day, probably not being recycled in another country. Very, very small percentage of plastics are being recycled properly. And so avoiding it, reusing it if you do have it, trying to reuse it is the best solution. If you have to buy something in plastic, maybe make sure that it's a more sustainable plastic that breaks down easier, or something that's more biodegradable instead of the plastic. Using your own containers. That's a huge part of it, I believe, is that these are small things that we can do as consumers. Buying organic food, organic and regenerative farming practices are helping to sequester the carbon. They're not contributing to the carbon problem. And so if we're supporting those farmers, then we are supporting the health of the planet and the health of ourselves in the future, so that we can slow down this global warming devastation that's happening. So we can make a meaningful difference. Collectively, these efforts can slow the pace of climate change, protect vulnerable ecosystems, and ensure a livable planet for future generations. The choice is in our hands, so let's act today for a better tomorrow. Thank you for listening today. I really appreciate all of you, and please spread the word. This is very important. And making the right choice of who we're voting for in policies that stand with this, that are going to help support a future of going away from exceeding global warming and not denying what's happening. So I think anyone listening knows what I'm talking about, that it's pretty serious. And we definitely don't want people in there trying to make things worse. And so who's the better candidate? I think you know who it is. Someone that does not deny that this is an issue, someone that is going to do good things. Maybe not everything is going to be good, but more good is going to be done. And so please vote in the right direction for the people in power that care about this issue and that care about you, and not just their pocketbook, but about the people that will help us on a higher level. So we have to vote. We have to support those in legislature that are acknowledging that this is an issue and that aren't denying that there's no such thing. Okay, it's obvious. And I thank you so much. Again, have a beautiful day. Talk to you later. Bye. Why boasted thyself, O evil man? Playing smart and not being clever. I said you're working iniquity to achieve vanity. But the goodness of Jaja endureth forever. So if you are the big tree, we are the small axe, ready to cut you down, to cut you down.